Really quite an honor to be here, and thank you for the opportunity. On Thursday, I married the love of my life, Stephanie. So you'll forgive me if I say this is the second best thing this week. And before I get started, I just want to say I had a quick conversation, and we were on technical difficulties.
No, just getting it, Ron. Nice and comfortable with you.
Thank you.
Is that it?
Yeah, it's good.
Perfect?
Yeah.
Okay, yours.
So on the way from, now I'm a little bit tired. We were delayed 12 hours getting in yesterday, so that was a fun adventure through Air Canada. Very wonderful. Yeah, so a little bit tired. But interesting, we had a conversation on the cab from Nanaimo to Duncan. And a lot of the things we're going to be talking about today, the guy who was not very political, the cab driver, and he was talking about a lot of things. Foreign aid, how our money's being given away, not helping Canadians being given to other countries, not being able to trust the government. So we may not hear it in the media, but I think there's a lot more people out there who believe what we believe than it seems. So again, we're here together today because we love our country, we love Canada, and we're here because we know something is going seriously wrong in the country we love. Everywhere we look, we can see our country being weakened and torn apart by dangerous internal and external forces. And those forces are the three biggest threats facing our nation: globalism, identity politics, and Islamism. Globalism seeks to erase any sense of a unified Canadian state, erasing our borders, wiping out national sovereignty, and taking governance away from the Canadian people, while turning our country into a post-national state that is incapable of defending itself either militarily, economically, or culturally. Identity politics is a dangerous ideology being pushed on our university campuses and spreading like a sickness throughout our society. It devalues the uniqueness and dignity of the individual, divides everything into oppressors and the oppressed, seeks to wipe out Canadian history, as we can see with statues of John A. Macdonald being torn down across the country, and is turning our entire nation into nothing more than a bunch of angry tribes at each other's throats, begging the central government for a few scraps. Islamism brings the threat of violence, terrorism, and hatred into our country. While most politicians are too afraid to confront it, the reality, which has even been reported by leftist papers like the Toronto Star, is that in many mosques in the country there's vile anti-Semitism, calls for jihad and violence, and ideological attacks on our freedom as Canadians. Islamism threatens and silences reformers within Islam, puts Canadian citizens at risk, and sees Canada as a land to be conquered. It even leads to, it even leads to cowardly politicians turning a blind eye to the threat of ISIS, even letting ISIS terrorists come back into our country. If not confronted, those three threats will destroy Canada as we know it. And that's why the work you're doing at Freedom Defence Canada and the work we're doing here today is so important. We're standing up for the majority of the Canadian people who reject the agenda of those who want to tear apart our country. Now, obviously, it can sometimes feel that we're alone as common sense Canadians. The increasingly corrupt establishment media often serves as pro-Trudeau, pro-liberal leftist propaganda, and it makes extreme left-wing people seem a lot more prevalent in society than they really actually are. They ignore common sense Canadians, they make fringe leftists falsely seem like moderates, and they provide cover for the forces of globalism, identity politics, and Islamism that threatens our country. But despite the massive power utilized by the government, and despite the media propaganda machine, Canadians can still sense that something is wrong. That's why your organization exists. That's why my website and other websites going against what the media is talking about are growing, and that's why we're here together today. And now it's time to address the first threat facing Canada, globalism. Globalism is the ideology that believes national governments should place the interests of foreign countries and international institutions above the interests of the nations they're elected to serve. Globalism leaves serious problems within our own country unsolved, while our money gets torn out of our pockets and given to people who aren't even Canadian citizens. Globalists believe it's wrong to put Canada's interests first. They think that Canadian patriotism is somehow a bad thing, and that love for our country is nothing but a relic of the past. They think Canadian citizens should just go along with whatever the United Nations, multinational corporations, and international elites want, even when our own prosperity and security is threatened. The globalist mindset is having a devastating impact on our country, and it leads to a betrayal of our citizens. This betrayal is often cleverly hidden by the establishment through stats that are manipulated to give a false picture of what is really happening. For example, we're supposedly told that we're richer than ever, our economy is doing better than ever. But where it was once possible for one spouse to work and be able to afford raising a large family, have a good house and at least one car, that's now more and more out of reach for people, especially young Canadians. The embrace of globalism by the ruling politicians has had a devastating impact on all Canadians. And as I said, including among young Canadians, and there's a massive affordability crisis, something that really doesn't get mentioned much, who are seeing the opportunities and dreams of our parents' generation increasingly slip out of reach. And you can obviously see that in Vancouver, where a lot of Canadian citizens can't even afford to live there anymore. And a lot of money from China coming in, which is interesting. I'll be addressing that a little bit later. And a big part of this is, it's because politicians who put globalist virtue signaling ahead of what's good for our own people. An example is the global urbanist movement, which wants to constantly, build cities up and, put land use restrictions in. We have tons of space in Canada. There's no need for us to be restricting our cities at all, but we have a lot of politicians who restrict where we can build. That ends up raising housing prices, and again, a lot of young people can't afford to live in our own cities. You see it in Vancouver, and you see it with universities becoming more and more expensive, even as it becomes less and less useful because of the identity politics that I'll be addressing later.
Yeah.
Higher taxes and higher energy prices make life more expensive every year, and our economy becomes less and less competitive, reducing the amount of good, secure jobs that are available. It was interesting, just to go off topic a bit, there's a report, I think 2 days ago, saying Canada has had a human economic stimulus, and they said, our economy is growing, not as fast as the States, but it's growing because we have more immigration. But if you bring in more people, that doesn't mean the average person is richer off, right? I mean, you could bring in 10 million people and the economy will grow, but it doesn't mean we'd be richer, right? So that's one way the media really manipulates a lot of stats, so something to keep an eye on. We see the cost of globalism in some very tragic ways. In the community of Pikangikum in Northern Ontario, the suicide rate is 250 per 100,000 people, and that's actually the worst suicide rate on earth, and it's been like that for over 20 years. And so year after year, the government gives foreign aid to other countries saying, there's people in other countries we need to help out, when we have the worst suicide rate right here in Canada, and it's not getting addressed. So our own citizens suffer, and our money ends up enriching people who aren't even Canadian. The globalists have created a situation in which Canadians often can't afford to grow our families. The younger generations, it's tougher and tougher for them to have kids because it's tougher to afford life. And then we get told, we need to grow our economy with massive spikes in immigration, right? It doesn't really make sense if your own people can't afford to grow their families to keep bringing in more and more people. Interesting priorities. Our household debt ratio is the worst on earth. It's worse in Canada than it was in the United States before their housing crisis. So if things were really going so well, and if globalist economic policies were working, why do Canadians have to go into world record levels of debt just to make ends meet? If we look beyond the propaganda that's pushed on us by the government and much the establishment media, the damage is pretty clear to see. We can see it in how the energy industry in Canada is suffering. We can't even build a pipeline in our own country. Our coal industry is being destroyed, eliminating thousands of jobs. Also, Catherine McKenna has a nice talking point at all her global conferences. It's funny, she tells us all to use less energy, and then she flies everywhere, all over the world. So she could use Skype, that's technology, right? When it comes to things like the Paris Accord, we're seeing that we're being slammed with a carbon tax. Our money is ripped out of our pocket so we can save the planet from climate change, even though emissions in Canada were actually down between 1990 and 2015 without a carbon tax, even though the United States has reduced emissions far more than Canada, and actually far more than any country in the last few years without a carbon tax, even as their economy grows. And even though the rise in global emissions is entirely due to non-Western countries, particularly communist China. And if you look at the charts you see in Europe, North America, emissions are down. In India and China, it's going up. So I don't know what we're supposed to do about that, but that's interesting. Trudeau, McKenna, and those with the globalist mindset claim to be defenders of science and facts, yet the science and facts show a carbon tax on Canadians will do nothing for the environment and is just a tax grab designed to take away more of our economic freedom and give it to the central government. Canada's less than 2% of global emissions, and our emissions have been going down. Well, as I said, emissions keep going up in China. And when you include Canada's vast forests, we actually absorb far more CO2 than we emit. So countries should actually be paying us money to help us. Even if we shut down our entire economy, it wouldn't make any real difference in terms of world emissions. And very interesting, Justin Trudeau actually admitted that a few days ago. He went on the Tout le Monde and Parle and said, even if we stopped all development in Canada, it doesn't matter because what other countries do is... So maybe you should cancel the carbon tax, then very interesting. But you notice that hasn't gotten much coverage, right? You haven't seen that all over the media, it's not being talked about too much. So despite that, Trudeau and the globalist elites expect us to believe that the key to saving the world is for us to devastate our economy here in Canada. There's also the absurdity of the government letting foreign-funded far-left groups come into our country and try to poison the minds of the Canadian people against our energy industry. As a result, we can't even get Canadian oil across our country, and we end up importing oil from countries like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, a socialist state where the leaders get fat while the people starve. Meanwhile, as we import oil from foreign countries, our own oil trades at a gigantic discount of about $50 a barrel compared to West Texas crude. Now, what's interesting is Canadian oil is actually less valuable than oil from Venezuela at the current time. So Venezuela is a country so messed up that people are actually breaking down fences at zoos, crawling into animal enclosures, killing animals and then eating them because there's such a horrible food shortage. People are killing their pets for food. People are eating spoiled and rotted meat. People can't find toilet paper, and the inflation rate is over 5,000%. And despite all of that, Venezuelan oil still sells for higher than Canada. So, something to think about. The oil price discount costs us millions of dollars every day, and it's because of the lack of pipeline capacity, which in turn is because our government doesn't have the guts to stand up to the foreign groups that are trying to destroy the Canadian oil industry. It's a total betrayal of Canadians, and it's causing incredible anger, especially among Albertans who are being used as a piggy bank for the central government while being denied the right to achieve their full prosperity. I mean, every year Quebec gets billions of dollars from Alberta in equalization payments, and then they tell Alberta, keep sending us the money, but you can't build up your oil industry because we don't want pipelines. So, interesting. Bit of a double standard there. And of course, that's not the only way that globalism is hurting our nation. Foreign aid is a huge problem. Every year the government takes billions of tax dollars out of the pockets of Canadians and gives it to foreign countries and foreign institutions. There's lots of examples of it, but just a few weeks ago, the Trudeau Liberals announced $50 million in aid to the Palestinians through the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. And what makes that so disgusting is that the UNRWA has been caught funding horrific anti-Jewish and anti-Israel propaganda. They create textbooks and distribute them to Palestinian children, and those textbooks have pages of anti-Semitism, a denial of Jewish and Christian religious sites, Israeli locations erased, and calls for violence and war, and now Canadian taxpayers are giving millions to that group. The Trudeau government is also giving money for what they call sexual health in Africa. They're even building a road for the Jordanian army at a time when our own armed forces are in total disrepair. And all of this happens as Justin Trudeau says Canadian veterans are, quote, asking for more than we're able to give right now. And that right there, that really sums up the globalist mindset perfectly. There's somehow always money for foreign countries, but when it comes to helping Canadians, the money just disappears. Now, the concept of foreign aid often sounds nice, you know, a country helping out other people, but when we really think about it, it's actually quite a horrendous thing. The Canadian government exists, or at least is supposed to exist, for the sole purpose of serving Canadian citizens. It's not called the world government, it's not the United Nations, it's the Canadian government, and Canadian is supposed to mean something. It's supposed to mean that all the tax dollars that the government gets should be funded on Canadian citizens and spent on Canadian citizens. After all, citizens of foreign countries aren't paying Canadian taxes, so why should Canadian taxes go to citizens of foreign countries? Foreign aid is immoral and wrong in every possible way. While our veterans are left to fend for themselves, while millions of Canadians live in poverty, while many Indigenous reserves resemble third world countries where there's no jobs, no running water, no opportunity, and massive crime, while young Canadians face an affordability crisis, and while many Canadian seniors who built this country are struggling, the government takes billions of dollars away from us and gives it to other countries. Now, if people want to help a foreign country, they should be free to give them their own private funds to whatever group they want to give, but that should be a choice for individuals, not a choice forced on us by the government through the extraction of our taxes.
Right.
Wow.
Now we look at what's happening at the Canadian border. Our laws are being disrespected as illegal border crossers, and that's the right term regardless of all the BS irregular crossers talk they like to say. So legal border crossers are streaming into the country, and not only they're not legitimate refugees. I mean, they're not coming from a war-torn country, they're coming from the United States, the biggest economy in the world, democratic country, a country of freedom, and they're causing a significant financial burden on Canadian taxpayers. For example, in Toronto, many homeless shelters and emergency shelters are over capacity because they're housing a lot of illegal border crossers there, meaning homeless Canadian citizens are being pushed out to make way for people who have no legal right to be in Canada. It also pushes back legitimate refugees and legal immigrants, including many Christians who are brutally oppressed around the world, to the back of the line. And again, something you never hear about, Christianity is still the most oppressed religion in the world. Again, something you don't hear much in the media. Now, it turns out less than 1% of the illegal border crossers have been deported, which sends the obvious message that the government has no interest in enforcing our laws. The cost is already into the hundreds of millions and will certainly reach above $1 billion unless the illegal crossings are stopped. And all the money spent on that is money that obviously can't be spent on Canadian citizens. Now, we know that borders are a form of national defense and national protection. It's a boundary and it's a statement saying this is our territory and we get to decide what happens on this territory. Our border is supposed to be under our control, under the control of the Canadian people. And having control of our border means that we decide who's allowed in and who isn't. It means we enforce our laws, and that those who disrespect those laws by crossing illegally are swiftly removed from the country. But the Trudeau government doesn't believe in borders. Trudeau wants us to be a globalist, post-national state. And how can a post-national state enforce borders? After all, when you love something or someone, you protect it. And when you love your country, when you're a Canadian patriot, you love Canada and you want to protect it. But in the eyes of the globalists, patriotism is wrong and loving your country is wrong. They think we should love some vague and undefined idea of the international community instead. So if you're not supposed to love your country, you're not supposed to protect it. And post-nationalism and love of country simply can't go together. Since borders are a form of protection, it's no surprise that globalists don't accept the idea of borders. It's also no surprise that the Trudeau government claims that our so-called UN obligations somehow force us to allow people to cross illegally. And it's interesting how selective he is in talking about that. When it's about enforcing borders, he says, oh, the UN, all the laws, we can't do anything about it. You know, he's breaking a lot of the UN laws by legalizing marijuana. He doesn't seem too concerned about that, so it's just interesting to think about. And, you know, talking about the UN and blaming the UN or using that as the excuse is exactly how you'd expect a globalist post-national government to spin it. It's a prelude to taking even more of our sovereignty away from the Canadian people and handing it over to the UN and foreign institutions. And speaking of national sovereignty, a nation can't truly be secure and sovereign if it doesn't have the means to defend itself. And right now we don't. Canada barely has an air force, we barely have a navy, and while our troops are the bravest and most skilled in the world, something other countries can attest to, there aren't even close to enough of them, as our land forces are tiny in number. The stark reality, and something that should both terrify and embarrass all Canadians, is that we have no real ability to defend ourselves. Our strategy is simply to hope for the best. We spend less than 1% of our GDP on our military, and our forces are horribly depleted. And the spending is actually worse than it seems, because the Trudeau government readjusted the GDP or the spending numbers to include things that normally aren't considered part of the defense budget in the defense budget. So we could say, oh, we're technically over 1%. It's actually much closer to 0.8%. So now we're often told that Canada is a small country in terms of population, and that means we can never have a strong military. But the reality is far different. Canada has a larger GDP than Russia, and Russia is regularly considered the second or third strongest military power on Earth. Canada is richer than Russia, we're more technologically advanced than Russia, and that means there's nothing stopping us from having a much stronger military than we currently do. We know we live in a dangerous world, and anyone who denies that is being naive. Already nations like China and Russia are encroaching on Canada's north, and right now Canada has no control over our northern territory. As journalist Paul Coring wrote, not a single Canadian warship or submarine can operate in or under the ice. The only active duty Air Force unit north of the 60th parallel, which is oddly named the 440 City of Ottawa Squadron, consists of exactly 4 unarmed Twin Otter bush planes based at Yellowknife Airport and tasked with search and rescue throughout the entire Canadian Arctic. An area that would rank as the world's 7th largest nation and is larger than India in terms of territory. So 4 planes for a place larger than India. The newest of the Twin Otters was delivered in November 1971, 6 weeks before Justin Trudeau was even born. The Twin Otters also used to have floats, but the Air Force got rid of those because they decided water landings were so infrequent that maintaining the pilot expertise wasn't worth the cost. He adds no major power, including the United States, accepts Ottawa's claim that the Northwest Passage is Canadian territorial waters. All the major powers have now eclipsed Canada's capacity to operate in the Arctic, in the air, as well as on and under the ocean. Even nations like Germany, South Korea, and Sweden routinely send vessels into the summer Arctic with ships newer than or as capable as Canada's aging flotilla. So if South Korea can do as good as Canada in our own territory or close to our territory, It's a bit of a problem. Now, obviously, as we've seen throughout history, weakness invites challenge, and a weak country is a country that is not secure, free, or truly independent. History shows that nations who thought they were safe and secure one moment could face total war and destruction in the blink of an eye, and we can never be certain what the future holds. That lack of certainty means the only way to ensure a nation is safe is for our nation to be strong, and being strong means having the power to defend our territory militarily. Oops. We need a strong Air Force, we need a strong Navy, and we need strong ground forces. And right now, we have none of that. Of course, it doesn't have to be this way. As we remember from the Avro era, Canada has a strong history of military innovation and creation. We have a history of building formidable fighting forces to defend freedom. In World War I and World War II especially. In fact, at the end of World War II, we had among the most powerful Navy and Air Force in the world. A strong military was a part of our national history and our national heritage, and it was who we were. But then the peacekeeping myth, in tandem with the increasingly globalist trend of surrendering Canada's decisions to the United Nations, caused our nation to in many ways lose sight of our military history. Military budgets atrophied, our forces got smaller and smaller, our procurement process became what can only be referred to as a pathetic disgrace, and our military ended up being an afterthought among all political parties. That leads us to where we are today, where we watch the spectacle of Canadian leaders trying to be taken seriously in disputes with countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia, and having absolutely zero leverage because we have no military power. We talk loudly and we carry no stick. That ends up making us more and more dependent on the United Nations, since our only hope for defense is to hope that nobody ever gets angry with us and tries to take what we have. And history shows that's a dangerous and possibly deadly bet to make. And I think this is something we haven't really thought about enough in Canada. I mean, we have a relatively small population, a massive amount of territory, and tons of the resources that most countries are desperate to get. So we shouldn't think that, if things went really wrong, if there was a big world war and countries got desperate, it wouldn't be, it wouldn't be shocking for countries to try to take our territory. So I think we need to be aware of that possibility and prepare for it. The reality is simple. Unless we build up our own forces, we can never truly be secure as an independent nation. But of course, again, the globalists don't want independent nations. They want weak and vulnerable countries, and right now that's exactly what Canada is becoming. Now, the establishment media treats all of this as just some sort of random set of occurrences, but we know all these things are connected. Depriving our nation of wealth for the sake of the Paris Climate Accord, giving our tax dollars away through foreign aid, the continuing illegal border crossing crisis, and our almost non-existent military all demonstrate how dangerous it is having globalist leaders in power. Globalists do not believe in the idea of the nation state, they do not believe in borders, and they do not believe Canada should be strong. And if we want to defend and restore the Canada we love, we must never allow our country to become a post-national state.